When you look at a story in any type of media, something that will be present in almost all of them is some sort of urgency. It doesn't have to be world-ending, it can simply be emotional urgency, but in order for a story to feel engaging, urgency almost always has to be present. But in a video game, where the player isn't just an observer, but is actively making choices and playing the game, urgency can become quite weird. What I mean is, we've all had those experiences playing a video game, where a character or an action tells you that there's something that you urgently have to deal with. Otherwise a character will die, a bomb will blow up, the world will end, or a multitude of other things. But after being told this, we often get the option to just not deal with it, for however long we want. You can go and complete side quests, explore the map, get collectibles, or maybe even do any minigame that the game offers. Meanwhile, whatever urgent thing is happening just waits. And that's because, well, the game revolves around you. This is really what distinguishes a video game story from any other type of media. When a character in a movie hears that the world is gonna end unless you stop it, you won't see them going out and running errands first. They'll rush to stop it. That's because in a movie or a book, the world doesn't wait for the protagonist. It continues developing and moving forward with or without them. For example, if the protagonist fails to act, in theory, the antagonist wins. Now of course, in a narrative sense, that's not for example how a movie works. The story is designed to play out in a way where the protagonist will interact and engage with the antagonist. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a fun story to watch. But the key difference here is the fact that we as the audience have no control over the pace of events. We don't dictate when or how things happen. Everything is tightly scripted. The world moves forward regardless of if you leave the TV on and walk away. It moves forward without you, and events play out in the time that they're designed to. The only way for you to slow everything down is by pausing the movie or putting the book down, in the same way that you can pause a video game. But here you're just pausing the events altogether. You're not changing the pace of when they happen. When it comes to video games on the other hand, the game world reacts to you. Without your involvement, there is no progress. You might not dictate the actual events that unfold, but without your involvement, they never happen. You could just boot up the game and sit back and watch, or walk away, and antagonists stand frozen in time waiting for your arrival. And if you choose not to engage with the story and not to move on to the next mission, then nothing happens. You can actively change the pace of things unfolding, and the overall urgency within the story. All the game can do is try to influence you to move forward, because without you, there is no game. But before we really get into this video, I want to put a disclaimer that I'll be using story-centric in-game examples from some games that you see on screen. Some are minor spoilers, some are major ones, so if you don't want to see that, I'd highly recommend that you either click off now or just skip past the section pertaining to the game you haven't played. In order for a story to feel engaging, there usually needs to be some kind of urgency or thing that happens that's supposed to be time sensitive. This could be anything from a loved one that's going to die, wanting to get revenge on somebody before they get away, or even just something emotionally urgent for another character, like you having to rush after them to comfort them. And when speaking about urgency, there are usually two types of urgency in the game. The first is what I'd call true urgency, which is where you're actively being pushed forward due to consequences that happen if you don't keep going. And the second one is the illusion of urgency, or implied urgency. Implied urgency, meaning when the game, while you're in a safe area, tells you or in another way communicates that you're supposed to keep going, but there's no consequences present if you choose to do something else first, or if you just want to stand around. Looking at direct urgency first, some of the classic ways that games do this is usually by putting a timer on you, where you have to reach a certain point or the mission fails, like running after somebody or escaping from somewhere within a time frame. Generally, the timer in and of itself isn't a timer that's available on screen, but you will get some kind of visual or audio indication, such as a bar going down, a person running away from you that you need to keep up with, or sound getting closer or farther away from behind you, indicating that you're actively being chased. These are all straightforward ways to urgently move you forward. They also generally mean that while in those sections, that's your only thing to do, and not keeping up with the game's pace will directly cause you to lose. In these kind of locations, there generally won't be any supplies or collectibles, because the game gives you no time to do anything else besides keep going. The purpose is just for you to feel that tension, and to, for example, build fear, and it's also usually a good tool for getting you immersed. The second one, implied urgency, is where the game wants to make you feel as though urgency is present and that you have to move forward without actually providing consequences for not following that urgency. This generally applies to either between missions in open world games, such as when you're traveling from one place to another, or in the safe areas inside missions, which can apply both to open world games and linear games, meaning those moments after you defeat all the enemies, escape an area, or really just any place that's supposed to act as a breather for you. In these breather areas, or while you're just traveling around in an open world game, you have a lot more freedom. In a linear game, you might walk around looking for supplies or collectibles, or just take in the scenery. At the same time as your character might need to keep moving forward if you look at the context of the story. This same thing can occur when you're just roaming the map in between missions in an open world game. So it's in these times especially that the game will utilize implied urgency, to make you feel like you can't just mosey around. This effect is usually a combination of multiple factors, which all create that feeling of urgency. The main driving point always has to be that the overall story is truly gripping and that it has characters that you deeply care about. But alongside that, the game has little tricks that it can utilize to try and keep you aware of the urgency. If done correctly, this all causes you to continuously want to move forward and forward. And this is the type of urgency that I want to focus mainly on in this video. Like I said, the story of a game in and of itself almost always has to contain something urgent in the overall narrative. But there are different ways the game can inform you about this. For example, it could be through cinematics, dialogue between characters, gameplay, or other ways. With both the action itself of what is occurring, alongside the dialogue and the way the dialogue is delivered, contributing to the illusion of urgency. Like I mentioned before, time pressure, while generally not work in open world games, work well in closed world games, and can of course work inside of active missions in an open world game. You shouldn't show an actual timer on screen, instead you can use things like a creature that's chasing you and kills you if you don't keep moving, a house collapsing around you where you have to keep moving, or any number of other things that work in the same way. You have more freedom to establish actual threats tied to the pace of the game, and failing to respond to the urgency will result in death or failure. And also, whenever you're told to hurry up somewhere when it's the only place you can keep going, you're more likely to go ahead and go there immediately. There's nothing to explore in the meantime. Now, of course, the problem still exists here in linear games, like I said, because you're presented with these safe areas that are used as a sort of break from the sometimes hectic gameplay. In these areas, if they're inside of a part of the story where it's highly urgent for you to keep going, the game often still wants to convey to you that you should keep going, and do so quickly. For example, in The Last of Us, a lot of times after closing doors you'll see them being pounded on, looking as if they might break down at any moment. This in and of itself creates this urgency in us as a player, but we want to keep moving forward. We of course know that the previous place we went through is now deloaded and not accessible anymore, therefore the door won't be broken down, but we still want to keep going. It acts as a cue for the game to tell you, hey, you gotta hurry up here, which we subconsciously pick up on. It makes us feel uneasy regardless of knowing that the door will stay shut, so we want to get away from it. However, even in linear games, sometimes exploration can clash with the story. Taking a look at The Last of Us Part 2, there are many moments where in the story we're on a clock. Like in Abby's section of the game with Lev, where they have to reach the hospital to get the meds for Yara, and you supposedly have 2 hours to get there. You're still very free to roam around each location, looking for supplies or artifacts regardless of the time you take, despite only supposedly having 2 hours. And it's also often necessary for you to do so, especially while playing on a higher difficulty, since you will need those supplies. So you as a player, knowing that there's no real timer on you, feel you can take your time with things, while Abby as the character will want to keep going as fast as possible, only grabbing whatever she comes across on her path. So that creates a sort of divide. Often games will remind you that there are pressing matters at hand by your companions or allies telling you to keep going, get a move on, or something similar, yet the game itself presents an area that encourages you to explore. It's as if the narrative and gameplay are pulling you in 2 different directions. But because of the fact that there doesn't really exist any urgency, the game tries to continuously remind you of the urgency that's in the context of the story, in order to keep you engaged. And to achieve this, there does need to exist some sort of consequence that just moseying around causes. This can be as simple as just different voice lines, like as I mentioned, characters giving you a little heads up from time to time if you take too long, or if you're not moving forward when you should be. I love this little voice line from when Yara and Abby are on the Seraphied Island.
Get your supplies and let's go. Okay.
Because it so perfectly ties in your actions as the player, looking for supplies with Abby herself doing so in the overall story, and it once again makes you want to lose fast and keep going. This isn't punishing you as the player, but it serves as a reaction to your actions or your inaction in some cases. This also makes your choices seem like they matter more, because the goal of implied urgency isn't to actually try and trick you into believing that when you get to the next point in the story matters in terms of gameplay, and that it will cause a major shift in the story, because we as the player already know that it won't. Instead, it's about creating emotional context, to keep you engaged in the story and its characters, especially when the game is pulling you in 2 different directions with gameplay and story. Because when urgency is fake, if the storytelling is truly well done and all the pieces come together, we as the players put that pressure upon ourselves, and that's really the end goal. This also works because the game has spent that time building up this relationship with both Lev and Yara. But moving on to open world games, implied urgency can sometimes cause a bit of a paradox. You're quite limited in open world games as a developer. In linear games, sure, you can just stand around for however long you want, even while it's supposedly on a clock, but why would you? And if you do, you probably won't do it for long. But in open world games with a world and quests to explore, things become more difficult. The story will often insist that something urgent is happening, or that you have to deal with something and the time is running out, which is designed to create a sense of pressure and make you feel like there's things at stake. But at the same time, the game has this massive world in which it presents you with so many options of other things to do. Side quests, minigames, collectibles, and more. And sometimes these forces can really clash with each other. If you choose to explore and take your focus off the seemingly pressing matter at hand, the urgency that's been built up becomes kind of meaningless. But if you just mainline the supposedly urgent things first, you miss out on the freedom and joy of discovering the world that's been built up, and you lose that feeling of exploration and freedom that we play open world games for. If we take a look at an absolute classic game with one of the best and most fun open worlds, Skyrim, we get a good example of this. A little while into the game, you're tasked with going to Whiterun in order to warn the Jarl about the dragon that's in the wild. Here you're warned that if the dragon goes after Riverwood, they're helpless, so therefore the Jarl needs to know so he can send troops. You're urged by the villagers to act as soon as possible to hurry over to Whiterun. In theory, this is very time sensitive since you and the villagers don't know when the dragons could attack. Now naturally, most people will go to Whiterun as this is the story they're supposed to follow. But the thing is, you don't actually have to do that. You can simply leave and go wherever you like. Explore the map, do other quests and then go to Whiterun. In fact, choosing to not go to Whiterun will make it so that the dragons don't start spawning. Things are just frozen in time. There's no threat of the dragons until you choose to continue the story in which they are a threat, because you as the player dictates the game and the pace of it. Ironically, by taking longer to go to Whiterun, you technically keep the village and world safer. And here is where urgency becomes a bit of a paradox within video games, because you need the setup of having something to happen now in order for the player to feel engaged and like there are actual things at stake in the story, and also to push them into playing the game the way that it's designed to be played. But especially in a game like Skyrim, where you have almost an endless amount of quests and questlines to follow, being forced to only go down one route can make you as the player feel trapped. And in this case, there's no real punishment behind not following the game's instructions. It's simply dialogue where the characters do their best to imply urgency. Because in an open world title like Skyrim, punishing the player for taking their time is at its core counterintuitive. You could of course narrow it down so you have to go to Whiterun first before being allowed to do other quests, but you still have the same problem here that the player might just want to go around and explore first, and they should be allowed to. But that in and of itself nullifies the urgency that's been built up. Alright, so then what type of implied urgency does work in open world games? In my mind, there's really only one thing that truly works here, and that's like I explored previously with The Last of Us 2. Building relationships to characters and then putting those relationships at jeopardy. Characters are what have to serve as the lead cause of implied urgency in general, because we care a lot more about them after hours alongside them than we do about the NPCs of the world. This does naturally mean that, in general, the early stages of games or the first part of the first installment of a franchise is likely to suffer in terms of implied urgency, regardless of what game type it is. Except for a very few rare amount of games that manage to get a grip on you right from the beginning. This is especially true for open world games where they can't just force you down one direction. For the majority of games, implied urgency only really starts to have any kind of real effect later in the game, because it takes time for us to learn to care about the characters if they're brand new. But if a story is well written, a big part of the story can still effectively use implied urgency, like in Insomniac Spider-Man with Aunt May becoming sick. We're used to seeing Peter and May having a strong bond, with a mother and son type of relationship. And of course, while she's usually important to the story, she's generally not a key part of it, at least not in the same way as in the game. Here we get to explore hers and Peter's relationship a lot, watching them interact with each other, learning the struggles that exist in their personal lives, how they're there for each other, and all the work that May puts into Feast. May's just a genuinely good person, and we come to care for her during the game, so when we learn that she's dying toward the end of the game, we feel emotionally invested. Most of us already wanted to stop Otto, but when this even more personal element gets added, it gets the emotional part of us going. Like Peter says, he has to hurry, and in the same way we want to hurry over to the next mission marker in order to stop Otto. Saving the world isn't that big of a deal to us, cause well, we have no real connection to it. But with Aunt May's life on the line, everything changes. We both want to find out what happens as soon as possible, and try to save her as soon as possible. So that combo makes the urgency feel more real. I don't really see a solution where especially open world games could establish some sort of investment for the player early on. Instead, focus will often fall on the later parts of the game. So what they need to do are focus on characters and relationships. The beginning of any new franchise where you're being introduced to the world is usually a big thing to take in regardless, with new mechanics to learn, a world to take in and more. And since you're playing a new game with a new world, those first few hours you will most likely go directly to the main quest and keep going forward to see what the game is all about. It's usually later on that you start exploring the map more and completing more activities. So that's when implied urgency should really take its place. Therefore, I see it as less of a problem that urgency isn't as present in the beginning of games. But throughout the whole game, especially after the excitement of the new world and new game mechanics fades away, the game never succeeds at keeping any kind of strong narrative urgency that's gripping for people who play games largely for the story like me. That means the game failed in the narrative section, in my opinion. Obviously, you can't do something like this too often, because that defeats the purpose of it, and there's a lot of work that goes into crafting the relationship to begin with. But when something like this really works, it turns out amazing, and it increases the immersion a lot. The game can definitely do more or less in order to make that implied urgency feel more real, but you as the player are the deciding factor. Your personality, how you approach the game and what weight you put on that urgency. Some people might play the game in a more roleplay-like fashion, trying to stay as true to the story as possible, and in that case you're bound to respond to the game's urgency. If something urgent is happening, you'll rush to stop it, as your character would, and to keep the story flowing. Others might still care for the story a lot, but aren't as strict about keeping their gameplay matched with the flow of the story. But if something else interests them more at the time, they'll go do that first. Naturally, most players fall somewhere in between, highly depending on how invested they are in the game's story. In the end, most urgency in games is just an illusion, and it always will be. But that illusion can feel stronger or weaker depending on how well the game sets it up, and how you choose to respond to it as the player. So if you'd rather finish a side quest before doing that really urgent thing, go for it. Because in video games, whatever's happening can usually wait.